Colleagues, friends, we've been put into this beautiful room with carved ceilings and excellent acoustics, which is already a good sign. Bodes well for the upcoming session. My name is Ilya Sverdlov. I'm the director of AFI's European Representative Office and also of Global Partnerships at AFI, which is hosting, together with the e-MFP, this session. My first comment in my short remarks is a word of huge thanks to our panelists, including two panelists who have traveled particularly far. Our colleague from our member institution from the Superintendency of Banks of Dominican Republic, who I understood took, what, 5 flights to get it? 3. Okay, I'm exaggerating. And of course, our colleague from the Palestinian Monetary Authority. My thanks also go to AFI's strategic private sector partner, GSMA, who's represented here by Barnaby, and of course, our technical expert, who I was told I would introduce by this very nice gentleman that we dragged off the street and we put in the center of our panel. Look, all jokes aside, today we will be discussing several important pillars of financial inclusion of forcibly displaced persons, or several lenses, I should say. The first lens, of course, is a policy and regulatory lens, and this is why we have our members here with us. The second is the data lens. Yeah? How do we collect data? How do we use data? How do we disaggregate data to inform policy decision making? The third one is the private sector lens. How do we leverage on private sector expertise to tailor products and services, particularly digital products and services, to this very vulnerable group. And the final one is a lens of partnerships. How do we work together and how do we exchange knowledge with one another in order to advance these important issues? Okay. I wanted to pause on the word important for a second, because these 4 lenses that I mentioned are important every day of our life, This is the bread and butter of what we do. But when it comes to times of crisis, they become not just important, they become pivotal, they become instrumental, whether it's crises as a result of conflict or whether it's crises as a result of climate change. The word important has its roots in medieval Latin, importare. And what this means is something of consequence, or something that leads to consequences. And what we will be discussing today is leading to tremendous consequences, hopefully positive ones. That's why this discussion is so important. Or if I may use another phrase, it will have ripple effects. When you drop a stone into the water, it has ripple effects. And these ripple effects can be in the form of informing policy, generating new ideas, strengthening partnerships, looking at how the public and private sector can work together better. So I will conclude just with an encouragement to have this important conversation lead to as many positive ripples as we can. And with this, I also want to thank the European Microfinance Platform for providing the dialogue platform to us, and my colleague Miriam, who leads AFI's Financial Inclusion of Forcibly Displaced Persons workstream, and who will now lead us into this discussion. Thank you, Miriam.
Thank you, Ilya, and a very good morning to you all. Thank you so much for joining this session. As Ilya, I think, alluded to, this is a topic that is very close to our hearts, and it's something that we really put a lot of energy into keeping quite high up the global policy agenda, just because of how consequential it is as a policy area. So I'm very happy to be moderating this session. At AFI, this is an area that we have been looking at for 8 years or so. And AFI, we are a network of more than 80 financial sector regulators or policymakers, largely central banks, And we have had the opportunity to witness over the years the evolving role of the financial policy maker and regulator in FDP financial inclusion. And essentially what I have seen is the role evolve from one facilitating financial inclusion for FDPs to one driving it. And I think this is something we will unpack a lot today because we have two regulators with us. Financial inclusion policies and regulations have a critical role to play in one, addressing the unique challenges that FDPs face, and two, in ensuring that our collective efforts, as Ilya had listed, important stakeholder groups within our ecosystem, that our collective efforts can sustain for the long term, while also taking forward the traditional mandate of central banks, which was mentioned yesterday, which is concerned with the application of global standards for financial integrity, like AML, CFT, and CPF, which causes a lot of the headaches related to know your customer, or KYC, and customer due diligence requirements, or CDD requirements, and financial stability standards, which impact how FDPs can access credit. So these are things that central banks must also keep in mind, protecting the formal financial system, while also taking the appropriate policy measures to include such a vulnerable or disadvantaged segment within our societies. In yesterday's plenary, if you didn't attend those, the one on advancing financial inclusion for refugees and FDPs and the subsequent breakout session, the speaker stressed that an enabling policy and regulatory environment is absolutely essential, and that many FDPs are actually in context without this. Policy and regulatory blockages or the absence of an enabling environment can impede our efforts to financially include FDPs. But encouragingly, at AFI, we are seeing this change. Although very gradually, with AFI member central banks taking a lead role, as I mentioned earlier, in developing financial inclusion policies and regulations that consider and are inclusive of FDPs, and in a growing number of contexts, they also now explicitly address FDPs to better mandate and also incentivize financial institutions to financially include FDPs. So, for example, our members like the Central Bank of Jordan, Bank of Uganda, Central Bank of Mauritania, all explicitly mention refugees as a target group in their national financial inclusion strategies. This mainstreams FDPs into policies and regulations, and it puts them together with other vulnerable groups like women and youth, so they are not forgotten. A lot of times we enter a country and it's forgotten. We don't see refugees in policies, we don't see them in regulations, and this is nice that it's changing. And in many of our member countries as well, our central banks have lowered KYC and CDD for refugees, allowing the use of UNHCR ID or other government-issued refugee ID for onboarding. And finally, I want to also highlight a couple of other things that financial regulators are doing. Reserve Bank of Malawi and Central Bank of Nigeria, they have developed national roadmaps for the financial inclusion of refugees, but also internally displaced persons, or IDPs. So this, to me, demonstrates that financial regulators now have the capacity to deeply understand FDPs as a target group, recognizing that they are not homogeneous. They can be refugees, they can be IDPs, they can be returnees, and they will all have different financial inclusion needs. So we shouldn't estimate the empathy and the capacity of financial regulators in low and middle income countries. We have a lot to learn from their experiences, and so we are so excited to have this session today. Yesterday also, I just want to provide some context in terms of numbers. Yesterday, the UNHCR highlighted that forced displacement numbers are actually worse than we think. So the official numbers are even worse than we know them. There are more than 120 million FDPs worldwide. 2 FDPs are in low and middle income countries, and 3, most FDPs are in protracted situations of forced displacement. So today we are so fortunate because we have 4 amazing expert speakers who will spotlight examples from the MENA region, the Latin American Caribbean region, and the Sub-Saharan African regions. And they will take us through how financial inclusion policy and regulation can be impactful when there is strong multi-stakeholder coordination, due consideration of the digital divide that we see FDPs falling into, and broader enabling policies for FDPs such as the right to free movement and decent employment, which in countries that is not Uganda probably do not have. So we are joined by Mr. Mohanad Salou, Chief of Financial Inclusion Division, Palestine Monetary Authority, the financial regulator of Palestine, Ms. Ines Paez, Head of Financial Inclusion Innovation and Inclusion at the Superintendency of Banks of the Dominican Republic, which regulates the banking sector of the Dominican Republic, Barnaby Willits-King, Research and Policy Director of the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Team at the GSMA. He leads their policy, regulatory, and advocacy work to support governments, international organizations, and operators in creating and enabling digital environment and overcoming policy barriers to digital and financial inclusion. Last but not least, and someone I'm really happy to have on this panel, Edward Fraser, who is a humanitarian consultant with over 15 years of experience in financial assistance, economic recovery, and market systems approaches with focus on forced displacement, and his expertise does include policy development. So we have the perfect people to take us through this today. I will start off the panel discussion with a question for Mohanad. We know that Palestine's context is extremely difficult both in the past and more so now. And PMA has a challenging task as the financial regulator in ensuring access to formal financial services in fragile circumstances. Can you please take us through the current context as you see it, and what the PMA has done to make this a bit better for the IDPs in Palestine? Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very happy to be here representing Palestine Monetary Authority and Palestine. Just to give you very quick brief about Palestine Monetary Authority. So Palestine Monetary Authority is the central bank of Palestine, and we are having the headquarters in Ramallah, the middle of West Bank, and also we used to have like a branch in Gaza. Very beautiful building used to be on the beach near the port of Gaza, which have been destroyed now. And most of our employees, we used to have 90 employees. Most of them, some of them have been killed by Israeli attacks, and some of them have been, or most of them have been flee out the country. So just give you, even before like the war, we used to work very independently, politically neutral in West Bank and Gaza, and this is what we do even now. So, and we, of course, we are comply with AML, CFT regulations. So the current context in Gaza, after the war, almost all banks, branches, we used to have like 56 branches, and almost 100 ATM machines have been destroyed completely. So, in this fact, there is no cash. And even if there is a very limited accessibility for the cash, it costs almost 20%. So the only way of getting and receive donations, cash allowances, and even like trading is use a digital channel. And because people having a trust in the financial system, trust in PMA, trust in a bank, even though if you like look any crisis like this in any other countries, logically, like when we have this crisis, the deposits start to be less or lower. In our crisis, no, it is the opposite. We have an increase in the deposit after the war, because people trust the banks, people trust PMA, trust PSPs, and it's the only way for them to survive. So we enhance access to digital channels, especially the e-wallets. And even before the war, just to give you the fact that almost more than 50% of people in Gaza are unemployed. So they used to receive donations, cash allowances through like the government ministry, social ministry affairs, or any other like donors. So we facilitate access to digital wallet for them, and we facilitate also opening bank accounts for them. So within PMA, we have a regulation for something called financial inclusion account, which is a free account, can be accessible for unbanked, and they can get all of the services freely. So we also enhance the digital onboarding, because in this case, opening an e-wallet need to visit a merchant or agent to identify yourself. So we have a very quick response working with the PSPs to enhance their digital onboarding, especially for Gaza. Also, we launched our instant payment system that allows all the people to transfer money and paying for their purchases through different bank account or through different e-wallet freely. This is helping them very well, because if you go to the merchant and if you're having like a different bank account than the merchant, you cannot pay for him. But with this service, you can pay for him free of a charge. Also, we have a problem with connectivity in Gaza, of course, after the war. So we help the people to get in touch, or to get something called, we require the banks and payment service provider to provide free G service, which is allow the people to access the bank account or the e-wallet application offline. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was taking notes because that's very interesting that you've done that. Exactly, that the regulator, in recognition that with less cash in the economy, you do have to move to digital, and being prepared for that in fragile context, I think, is so important, and which we will unpack further. But forced displacement exists across the globe. So let's move to the Caribbean region, and Ines, can you give us a bit of background of the context in the Dominican Republic, and how you've been working to include the Venezuelans?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thanks for the invitation, and to recognize the work that Joanna and Gabriel have been doing with how they designed the flow of the conversations regarding this topic. It was very, very nice design. In our case, well, we in Dominican Republic, we have received a significant Venezuelan community, because they have some governmental issues since, well, more than 10 years now. And even though we are an island, we have, let's say, an easy access, and we have several similarities with Venezuelan. One of them is the language. We speak Spanish, both of us. We have this geographic proximity, and as well we have a lot of cultural similarities, as we are in the Caribbean, so we like music, we like to party, and so on. And I think that's one of the things that it's attractive for them to go to Dominican Republic. So since 2012, we are receiving a steady flow of Venezuelans in Dominican Republic. And actually, that's something I want to rescue from yesterday that Ricardo from the IFC mentioned, and it's that usually when we think about refugees, sometimes we think that maybe they are not able to contribute to our economies. But in the case of the Venezuelans, they have, most of them, I don't have, but most of them, they have high level of education, so they can perform good roles in our society. And the ones that have lower levels of education, they are very, very good in service. So they can integrate themselves in our tourism industry, in the service industry. They work in restaurants, they work in disco, etc. And they are adding a lot of value and diversity in our workforce. So that's actually something very important to consider, because it's really meaningful for our economy. So, well, just to give you some numbers, we have around 120,000 Venezuelans. Our country is just 10 million. It's not so big. But just for you to understand, actually the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they start a normalization plan for the Venezuelans in 2021. And they came to talk with us and with other governmental agencies like the Ministry of Labor as well. So the idea was to find some alternative in order to integrate the Venezuelan community in the different aspects of the social and economic life. So we came with this regulation. The idea in our case, well, I have to admit that the anti-money laundering team, it's my best friends now, because I manage innovation risk and inclusion risk, so it's quite difficult for them to manage all my topics. But in this case, the idea with this regulation is to simplify the due diligence. I mean, we are allowing the banks, the financial entities, to open accounts and to open products and services with the passport and the Venezuelan ID expire, because they are already expired and they can go back home to renew their documents. So what we agree with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that we will allow all the Venezuelans that have entered in the country between January 2014 and March 2020. All the people that have arrived between those dates, we will make an exception for them, and we will accept the passport and the ID that even though they are expired. So in our case, we are opening bank accounts. We are giving them credit cards and credits depending on the appetite of the banks. But mainly that's the context of our situation.
Thanks so much, Ines, and thank you also for highlighting how you collaborated with your do you have a financial intelligence unit?
Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. In Dominican Republic, in the financial sector, we are split. We have the central bank that manage all the monetary regulations, and we as a superintendency, I think we are one of the members that are not central banks in AFI, but in our case, we supervise all the banks sector and other entities, and as well we do we have the financial. Sorry, your question?
Financial intelligence unit.
We have, it's a part, it's a different agency,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, and I asked that because that is an important link that we found from our work over the years, is how to get the AML, CFT, and CPF stakeholders talking to the financial inclusion stakeholders. Sometimes they are both in the central bank, they don't speak to each other, or sometimes the financial intelligence unit is a separate entity and on its own. And
yeah, it's a separate agency in our case, but even though we have, we have the anti-money laundering supervision team within the superintendency.
And that type of collaboration is important when you want to do things like lower KYC and CDD requirements for FDPs. And those conversations really do need to happen, and they're not easy. I have been in them. So when humanitarian partners and private sector talk about this, it's a work in progress and something, and that actually you should join in the conversation as well, and that's what we will promote to our members. So we'll move to Barnaby. As Barnaby, GSMA has undertaken so much important work on FDP financial inclusion. Actually, we learned so much from you. I use a lot of your expertise for our own work. Can you share some recent highlights with us and show us how policies and regulations have helped you in your work? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Miriam. It's great to be here. It's a slightly shorter trip for me from London compared to Inez's adventure. But it's great to be here and really appreciate the opportunity. And it's a really important conversation. And I mean, even so far, I've learned so much from the colleagues. Digital financial services have become such a fixture in modern humanitarian assistance and increasingly play a really important role in the day-to-day lives of FDPs. And so this is such an important conversation to pick up the policy aspects. The GSMA, for those of you who don't know us, is the global association that unites the mobile ecosystem. So our members are mainly mobile network operators, but also the sort of wider technology sector. And in the mobile for development part of the GSMA, we work to bring together the mobile industry with humanitarian partners, in our case, in the humanitarian team, with governments and with other actors. And it's really about building responsible digital ecosystems through public-private collaboration. So the work that we've done to date on financial inclusion has mainly been in East Africa, but we have a global role and we're increasingly looking at opportunities to spread our approaches in the Middle East and Asia, where clearly there's huge demand. As we heard from Mohammed, financial services for all people, but particularly displaced people, increasingly relies on this connectivity. And alongside that, the huge growth in mobile money is something that's super significant for financial inclusion as an opportunity. And all of that comes with a lot of allied policy and regulatory questions. So through our program, which is supported by the UK government, FCDO and others, we support a range of projects around FDP financial inclusion. Some of these are directly, so technical support for financial inclusion through bringing together the mobile industry in particular countries, financial service providers with humanitarian partners. So we've just kicked off a 5-year project with Visa, and that's to expand financial inclusion for women, for farmers, but also for FDPs through digital literacy. And we'll be starting that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So that's a really exciting program, lots of opportunities there. And that's building on experience that we've had in Rwanda, where we supported digitalizing VSLAs. In Somalia, we worked with the operator and organizations there to develop a really interesting biometric voice ID verification program for cash transfers in that really difficult context. So that's sort of directly working on financial inclusion, but actually supporting and enabling connectivity has been such an important area in order to provide the right platform for the types of product that Mohammed mentioned. But also for all the other ways in which people use connectivity that are sort of related. So entrepreneurship, communication, particularly people who are displaced, it's so important for them to be able to communicate and get information. But also leisure, important part of everyone's lives. So a couple of things that we're doing, particularly a huge initiative with UNHCR is the Connectivity for Refugees initiative, and that's aiming to connect every major refugee hosting settlement by 2030. It's supported by Government of Luxembourg and Spain, and that's really to unlock opportunities for refugees and service providers along the lines that we're talking about. So the really important point, I guess, just to finish on, is that the enabling environment for all of these activities is critical. And so we spend a lot of time working in coalitions, looking at the sort of enabling environment and where we, on behalf of the mobile industry, can bring some influence. We heard yesterday that Uganda is a very conducive environment And we successfully worked in recent years with UNHCR and others there to advocate with the government for refugees to be able to access SIM cards in their own name by recognizing the refugee ID, and so a range of services. And there's a similar process underway in Kenya that maybe we can return to. Thanks, Mariam.
Thanks, Barnaby, that's a really good start for us to understand how GSMA contributes to the FDP inclusion work. Of course, connectivity is such an important piece for us at AFI. We don't look at that part, so this is where it's so important when we work together to fill in that gap. So Edward, given your background in the humanitarian sector, as we've heard it, what's your view on the role of policies and regulations in making meaningful making financial inclusion meaningful, impactful, but also sustainable and not just a short-term solution? Can you share a few examples with us and some commentary also of what we've heard so far? Thanks.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me along. I may have been dragged in off the street, but I hope that I have something valuable to contribute to the discussion. But I guess particularly I've been brought in to bring a bit of the humanitarian perspective, cognizant that there are multiple other humanitarians in the room. I'll do my best to represent, but I'd love to hear views of others when it comes to the open discussion. I mean, needless to say, and it almost doesn't need to be said, but I'll reiterate it, that policy and regulation are critical to the achievement of our ambitions as humanitarians to the advancement of financial inclusion for forcibly displaced people. I've tried to keep a track this week of all of the different requests that have been made on the part of policymakers and regulators, and quite frankly, it ended up as somewhat of a shopping list. And I don't wish to repeat it, but I think I'll just mention a few that are critical. Obviously, the development of or the adaptation of national financial inclusion strategies to represent the needs and aspirations of forcibly displaced people. A particular focus on customer protection and the adaptation of existing customer protection policies and regulation to consider those that are uniquely vulnerable or who have experienced forced displacement. Creating an enabling environment for innovative solutions, not just digital but otherwise, to support advancing financial inclusion. We've learned a lot from those that are operating, for example, in innovative fintech, and I think the creation of enabling environments to support that is key. I won't delve into the topic of KYC, but simply to say that I think there is evidence of significant advancement in adapted or proportionate or tiered KYC approaches that many countries, including my own in the UK, could learn from. One thing I do want to mention that's been hinted at is looking at policy and regulation beyond the realm of financial inclusion. I don't want to delve too far beyond it, but specifically given that this is a microfinance focused and financial inclusion focused conference, but we cannot ignore and separate policy and regulation around financial inclusion from broader efforts towards economic integration, respect for the rights and welfare of forcibly displaced people, overarching strategy when it comes to welcoming and integrating refugees. And what I'd particularly like to point out, though it's not related to policy and regulation, is the increasingly hostile rhetoric in many European nations, and particularly in my own nation, towards refugees and those seeking asylum. And I mention this only because we cannot achieve what we're seeking to achieve with respect to policy and regulation of financial inclusion without redressing these broader issues. As I said, this ends up being somewhat of a wish list, and I think I'm in danger of doing that, and humanitarians have often fallen into that trap, being very demanding and asking much from others. So I'd just like to wrap up by focusing on what I term more than just collaboration, which I think has been a key theme of this week, but what I refer to as a collective imperative. And to recognize that it's not just the responsibility of policymakers and regulators, but a shared responsibility on the part of all those that are seeking to support and allied to the refugee cause to play their part in. And so I'll just mention 4 things that I think are key for humanitarian actors to consider when engaging and playing their role and fulfilling their responsibility in this collective imperative. The first is giving credit where credit is due. And we've already heard from Mohamed and Ines and multiple others representing policymakers and regulators this week of the significant advancements that are being made. And kudos to the role of AFI particularly for collectively analyzing, promoting, and disseminating the information on the vast improvements that have been made. We need to be cognizant as humanitarian actors of the sometimes severe constraints that our partners are facing. This is obviously particularly acute in fragile and conflict-affected settings, many of which are either the source of or host for many forcibly displaced people. And as well as was mentioned yesterday, cognizant of broader international standards that need to be respected by local or country-based policy makers and regulators. We need to be cognizant of these constraints. I'll give a quick nod. It was touched upon yesterday, the ecosystem approach. And it's often said that we need to take a more systems-based approach to avoid harming local financial systems, but also ultimately as actors to begin supporting and developing local financial ecosystems. And a key part of this, of course, is to consider not just supply and demand, but the broader policy and regulatory environment. And I'll conclude by picking up on a point that Nicole from UNHCR mentioned yesterday. We can be much better as humanitarians in collectively and in a coordinated way advocating for change in policy and regulation. That's both within our own community as humanitarians, but also engaging with other stakeholders within the broader ecosystem to make more coordinated and, let's say, consistent or coherent demands of our partners in working in policy and regulation. So in short, I hope I've given a sense that humanitarians, I think, need to approach this with a degree of humility and with an intention to collaborate and understand the constraints of those seeking to advance financial inclusion of forcibly displaced people.
Thank you so much for that, Edward. And similarly, financial regulators also need to learn some of the things that the humanitarian sector has expertise in and has knowledge of. For example, humanitarian principles that are human rights-based that we should be having knowledge of and also keeping at the back of our minds when we are developing policies and regulations for such a disadvantaged and vulnerable segment who sometimes could be persecuted by the government or their host country and so on. So these are also things that financial regulators, it's not something they're used to knowing, but they will need to learn as well. Now, policy is only as good as its implementation. And it's not always so rosy. Yes, we've heard some great things, some great examples, but I also want to hear from the speakers what kind of challenges arose when you were either developing the policies and regulations, implementing them, or operating or implementing your initiative within a certain regulatory environment. It will be really nice to know this and get into the headspace of that. Mohamed, do you want to start?
Okay, thank you, Mariam. Actually, there's a lot of challenges. To be honest, like working in Palestine and being in Palestine is with always instability of political situation there, we experience a lot of challenges. And this is sometimes helping us because we become an experience of dealing with crises and wars. Because you know about the situation there, and in a couple of years we have like some kind of war. But I need to admit, this war is something completely different. It's a genocide, and we never experienced something like this. So it makes us like very hard to work, especially in Gaza. As I mentioned, we lost most of our colleagues. We cannot work on the ground because it is very risky there. And but at the end of the day, we are flexible and we try to enhance our regulations through also the partnership with all of the stakeholders, like public, private, and either like humanitarian like agencies. who trust PMA and who work directly with us, especially in transferring the cash allowances for the people there who in need of that cash. So the main challenges, again, that we cannot work on the ground. One of the main challenges also that have been mentioned, that the financial literacy, especially the digital financial literacy. So suddenly, like many people who used to be unbanked, because as I mentioned, they used to be unemployed, their low level of income, they are under the poor level, but suddenly they become having like e-wallet or bank account while they don't have any literacy how to use it. And of course, in time of the wars, there's always misleading like information, sometimes misleading practices. So I think one of the main and our priority is working and enhancing the financial literacy for the people there, but we cannot, to be honest, do anything now until the war stop or we having a ceasefire. Of course, again, one of other main challenges, which is digital onboarding, and I mentioned how we get through this, because also nowadays PMA is working to having a new eKYC and digital onboarding system that works for financial sector. That will help a lot to enhance the digital onboarding for the unbanked people, especially who lost their documentation in this situation also. Yeah, so this is the main challenges and how we came up these challenges with our regulations, our instructions. We always follow up with our stakeholders, especially the banks and PSPs, and we issue always a new regulation as it's needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohana. Just a follow-up question. How has the crisis affected women and the inclusion of forcibly displaced women within households in this type of context?
Yes, this is a great question. Yes, of course, it affects everyone there, but again, yes, women affected very hardly from this war, and especially like for the women who will take more responsibilities because they become like they need to they become the household and they need to feed all the family, and many of them become again, as I mentioned, banked because they're receiving the cash allowances and they need to deal with this money, which is digitally, it's not easy to deal with that. So women, of course, having a very hardship life there, and we're trying also in our literacy messages, awareness messages, to focus on women, especially in Gaza. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. Ines, it's your turn. Dominican Republic also led the development of a new special report we have on financial inclusion of migrants in the Latin American and Caribbean region, and they shared a lot of learnings from that too. So maybe you can share some of the challenges in policy implementation from that.
Yeah, well, after listening to Mohana, I'm ashamed to talk about challenges. Sorry. But, well, in the case of the Venezuelan community, actually the financial entities, they have been very receptive about this regulation. And as someone mentioned yesterday in one of the panels, that, I mean, it's easy to implement the regulation. The difficult part it's after that, because in our case, for example, at the beginning it was okay, everybody will agree, we will launch it, and that's it. But there is a high turnover in the frontline service personnel of the branches. So we need, the solution is that we need to refresh the information, and we have to keep doing this follow with the financial entities so that they refresh with the information with the service officials, because sometimes the Venezuelans go to the bank and they don't manage the information. So that's an ongoing process that we have to keep on doing with the financial entities, and in order to avoid delays or confusion for this community. And as well as this is something that it's, I mean, they still have this governmental problem. So we renew the regulation every year, hoping that it will end soon. And yeah, and we have another, well, to give you some context, I think maybe I'm wrong, but I think we are the only island that have two countries. So we share the island with Haiti, and actually that was one of the challenges that we faced, because we are raising some concerns from the Haitian people, because they are asking, why are you doing something for Venezuelans and not for Haitian? But actually there is a very different criteria here, because in the case of the Haitian, they don't have documentation at all. So we cannot do neither simplify due diligence, because they don't have anything to show us. But anyway, we are trying to find an alternative for the case of the Haitian people, maybe a different, at least a different carnet with a photo or something. But that's something we have to manage with the migration authority. So basically, those were our main challenges.
Thanks a lot. Ines, Barnaby, you want to take us through some of the challenges you faced?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and picking up on some of the themes from Mohammed and Ines, I think this sort of idea that you can kind of change a policy and put in place a regulation, but then actually implementing it and making it really sort of filter down to the, you know, the service users, even in a conducive environment, can be really tricky, and we really see that where we sit with our engagements. I think an interesting example to sort of contrast with Uganda is what's happening in Kenya, and I may not be completely up to date because there's lots of sort of different things going on, but you know, there's a more conducive environment being sort of opened up with the current government, and the refugee ID has been recognized by the central bank, but there's a real kind of blockage in terms of then getting all of the other parts of the system to recognize that, and all of the relevant guidelines, but also then actually, I think Ned said, actually so that people, you know, in branches actually know what the regulations are. So there's a lot of work to be done in coalition again, working across government, working with our members, the mobile network operators and the mobile money providers, to sort of work, you know, with the different regulators. That's another challenge. It's not just the banking regulators, it's the comms regulator, it's the refugee authority, all of which sort of interact in complicated sort of bureaucratic ways. So there isn't really a quick fix, but I think recognizing the need to sort of map it out, build the relationships, understand the sort of the policy coordination environment is really important. The different, you know, different roles of different parts of government in different countries. In some places, the PM's office. In other places, it's, you know, in the Interior Ministry or wherever it might be. And so we see a real role for us to be able to speak on behalf of our industry, and you know, rather than it being just seen as a sort of a commercial sort of argument, it's like, no, actually, this is something affecting you know, refugees in terms of accessing these services, and so building those relationships and including important bodies such as UNHCR in that. So I guess the other, just to finish on another challenge that we see, which is a sort of an ongoing theme, is really understanding what the refugee needs are and what those policy barriers to them being included are. And we heard about this yesterday in the plenary. You know, lots of issues around KYC and identity, but you know, both the problems and the particular solutions are going to vary by country. It's really not a homogeneous group, as we heard from UNHCR. So I think that evidence gathering to be able to address the specific needs, address the right policy barriers by understanding the sort of environment within which we're operating is a critical challenge to overcome.
Thanks a lot, Barnaby. Also to build on the points by Mohanan and Ines. So I picked up coordination and the data bin. For data, what we've seen as a trend as well is, so in the financial inclusion community and for financial policymakers and regulators, they conduct national surveys on financial inclusion at the household level and at the MSME level. So now we've seen our members actually include the FDP population into the surveying exercise. And I think this is so encouraging because previously there was no data on FDP financial inclusion. The Global Findex doesn't have FDPs, or FinScopes don't have FDPs. So the national surveys are so important for this. Coordination is also important. When we were in Rwanda, we went to meet with the Central Bank, the National Bank of Rwanda, the Ministry for Emergency Management of the MENA, and they were handling the refugee situation there. And they said, it's the Central Bank that has to look at financial inclusion for refugees, not us. We have cash transfer programs, but after the NGOs leave, what do we have for the refugees? So it's actually, when we think about financial inclusion and meaningful financial inclusion, which is beyond cash transfers and using bank accounts, credit, insurance, pension, this is all, Rwanda is a country where this is, the headspace is actually moving towards that because the situation is so protracted. So thanks a lot for bringing those things up. Ed, I think you're next for the challenges. A bit quickly, then we can open up the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, I think I'll probably loop back to what I was raising originally around the collective imperative, because the first challenge I've found is putting that into practice, or putting particularly collaboration into practice. I think we've come a long way as a humanitarian sector beyond a time when humanitarian principles, which of course we hold dear, infringed upon or inevitably prevented our engagement with state actors, particularly those that are party to a conflict. I think we have to still recognize that as a challenge, but I think, and it still exists, but we're a lot better and a lot more nuanced at engaging with state actors and the various compartments of state actors in advancing such aspects as financial inclusion. But a critical issue that I've experienced personally and also amongst my colleagues is simply a lack of knowledge and expertise of the regulatory environment. And it's only ever really been approached by many individuals to advance the work of the humanitarian institution within which they work. And I have in mind particularly the work that's done around cash and voucher assistance. I won't delve into it too much, but simply to say that when we've considered regulation and the policy environment, it's only been with the intent of making our cash and voucher assistance more effective, rather than looking at, and as you've hinted at, more holistic and sustainable solutions beyond cash assistance. And I would say that links to a third challenge that I found is smashing the assumption or the myth that any form of cash assistance, even when done through bank accounts, is tantamount to financial inclusion. And that's not necessarily directly related to policy and regulation, but I think feeds into the policy and regulatory discussion, in that often we assume that the provision of a bank account, as I've said, is tantamount to financial inclusion, and yet there's much more, as we've seen during this week and from the presentations, that needs to be done in order to advance financial inclusion. The last point I'd like to raise, and I know we plan to discuss it maybe a little bit in more detail, is the difficulty in playing the role as an interlocutor between forcibly displaced communities and regulators and policymakers. It's been said this week that humanitarian actors have presence on the ground, have the trust of communities that they work with. And in certain instances this is true, yes, but I don't think it should be assumed. And there's also a broader debate as to whether we are best placed to speak on behalf of the communities which we're seeking to serve. And what I'd like to encourage in general is more direct engagement, not only with forcibly displaced people themselves, but also their nominated or elected representatives it's rare that humanitarians are formally elected to speak on behalf of forcibly displaced people. And I think in any engagement, whether it be around policy and regulation or more broadly, the voices of forcibly displaced people and their representatives should be at the forefront. And we need to be cognizant as humanitarians of speaking on behalf of anybody, but particularly vulnerable groups. And the last thing I'd like to do is give a shout out, not just to nominated representatives of forcibly displaced people, but particularly refugee-led organizations. We've heard from Bondeco this week, as well as Rufi, the ultimate winner of the award, but many others that are refugee-led organizations themselves, and I would argue they're far better placed in many circumstances than us humanitarians to advocate for policy and regulatory change. So on the one side, it's a challenge to speak on behalf of others, but I question whether it should really be us that does that. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot for that, Ed, because that question is very interesting to me, because in practice it is very difficult to get the refugee voice to the policy-making table, honestly. But a couple of, in Malawi and in Tanzania, though, our members actually have gone to the field to collect data and survey the FDPs, so they have been involved. They will sit in the focus group discussions and engage with the women, and we hear firsthand the troubles that FDPs face and the financial inclusion challenges. And I can see in the faces of my colleagues and my central bank colleagues, it changes you, because you realize, I mean, this is a refugee sitting in front of you with all these problems, and they were so touched. And I think that's a really nice thing to start doing for policy making. With that, we're about 11:45. I wanted to already open the floor, I think, at this point. I have a couple of questions more for the speakers, but maybe let's open the floor. Any questions for the speakers? Ilya, please. I didn't ask him to ask a question if it was quiet, by the way.
Thank you very much to all the speakers who have provided very important insights. One of the insights is that we're all in this together. Yeah, Edward has brought this forward, and that there are many considerations within and outside of the policy regulatory space. But we're all in this together if you look at what's happening around the world. Here in Europe, we're facing similar kind of challenges, and the regulators and the partners are adopting certain solutions. In the jurisdictions that were mentioned, in the Dominican Republic, Palestine, and others, you are innovating in significant ways. Where do you all see the potential to scale knowledge exchange and collaboration between, if I can call, developed and developing country policy-making institutions and partner institutions? Thanks. Where's the low-hanging fruit?
Thanks. Ilya, who would like to start between? Thank you. Ines, you want? Ladies first.
Yeah, actually at the end, this is, let's say it's an ecosystem, because it's not just the superintendency, as I mentioned, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Labor as well. And in the case of, let's say, other countries, in our case, for example, we give them, as I mentioned, the option to open an account and to have credit cards. And now we have these services from Visa and MasterCard where you can send money using the cards, the credit and the debit cards. So we are a country that receive a lot of remittances, and Venezuelans as well, they, Marianne mentioned about the data. We launched last year at the end of last year, one report regarding vulnerable segments, and one of them was actually these refugee people. That was one of the most difficult surveys that we have done. But what we found is that Venezuelan, they receive 20% of the people we interview, they receive remittances, but more than 60% they send remittances abroad. So those services from Visa and MasterCard are very helpful because it's an easy way to receive money. I mean, you don't have to go to a shop and to do the usual remittances flow, but you can send directly to a credit or debit card. And basically that's part of the ecosystem because those refugees, they need the money, they need to send money back home, and I think that's part of the ecosystem that is really meaningful.
Thank you. Ines Mohanan?
Yes, thank you, Mariam. Thank you, Ilya. Actually, I can say that collaboration and getting data and getting in touch of the need of these like category is really important. And again, the policymakers, regulators should lead like the initiative and being power as much as they can to collaborate and enforce their regulations to everyone. And in case of Palestine, I can say one of success stories that have been went through is, of course, the collaboration between not only PME and banks and service providers, but also with humanitarian agencies. And channeling all the payments and cash allowances through the digital way will enhance the transparency, and any other cases of fraud will be eliminated. And this is really important. So in case of Palestine, one of humanitarian agencies, UNICEF, you're all aware about it, who's leading and collaborating all the cash allowances transfer. So in this case, they make sure that the beneficiaries will not be duplicated or having any fraud. And they have all our support. And to be honest, also having the digital solutions like e-wallet, and even though we had within our regularity sandbox, nowadays we have a new solutions that we are testing also to enhance the cash allowances and give the people there multi-choices that can comply their needs. So this solution will provide the people with coupons of instead of cash that they can get their food and supplies. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Any of the other speakers want to?
Yeah, maybe just a quick comment to say that, I mean, we see a lot of really important learning in different ways, sort of regionally, peer-to-peer between countries. I mean, Kenya and Uganda, there's clearly a huge amount that they're sort of looking at each other and learning from. And I think sort of, you know, in all sorts of different directions between developing and developed countries. So I think this looking at policy solutions, looking at technical solutions, and this sort of environment of sharing learning is really important. I suppose just a final thought is that that can also be negative in the sense of, you know, some of the sort of anti-immigration, anti-refugee rhetoric also potentially spreading negatively. So I think there is definitely a need to focus on the positive examples where there have been policy solutions.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good one. And in fact, that's also how we inspire other, you know, we have success stories within the AFI network. We have 30 members who are in context of more than 30 in context of forced displacement out of the 80-some members that we have. And how we have, it's like we've promoted the success stories to inspire the others to not be afraid to pursue something like this, to also share the learnings and the challenges and the grievances, and even in looking to the future together. I think this has happened. Sometimes it's not easy at all. We don't all have Ugandas in the room, and it's very challenging work. So thanks a lot to the speakers for that. I have one short question. It's to do with the digital. Because what we found also is we talk about policies and regulations, but I don't really see refugee or FDP or other FDPs mentioned in national strategies for fintech, or if they're mentioned in specific regulations related to digital finance. So how can we ensure that FDPs do not fall into the digital divide as we move forward and bring everyone forward digitally? They're at risk of being forgotten. So just 2 minutes each, if that's okay, starting with Barnaby, please. Thanks.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I mean, maybe just to pick one thing that we do a lot of, and we've heard about this, you know, sometimes the private sector does not see refugees as a, you know, a market or a sustainable market. And I think so making the business case, bringing evidence to the private sector, especially in private contexts. There's a sort of story you've probably heard about, you know, Safaricom's mobile tower in Kenya in the Dadaab refugee camp, which initially they were very cautious about putting a tower up, and now it's one of their most profitable mobile towers. So I think it's about understanding the market and seeing where there are actually opportunities and providing the evidence for that. Thanks.
Thank you. Mohanan, you have...
Yes, I need to be honest, and from the Palestinian experience, even though the private sectors like banks, PSPs want to do something in this crisis, but at the end of the day, we did not give them the choice. To be honest, we enforced them. We told them, even though it's costly for them. Even they never complain, but you again, as a regulator, you need to take the initiative. You need to be the leader in this. So what we do, we just request from them. For example, we had a list of beneficiary, 15, 20,000. We divide them by the banks, and we tell them this is the list. They will open. You need to open accounts for them. You need to open e-wallets and the free. And we request them to provide the free G service also in their cost. So serving the people in this situation, it's not luxury. We don't see it as a social support. No, they are our people. They used to be active agents, clients who have been the banks getting profit from them. So it's now the time to get back them something. So to be honest, they don't complain, by the way, but and some of them, of course, actively more than the other. But at the end of the day, they all serving the people there. They give them all of the services freely, and they do as much as they can. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohanan. And anything to say about the digital divide and making sure we don't let them fall into that?
Yeah, I suppose I'll come at this from a protection angle, and I think one of the critical things in any discussion about redressing digital divides or including people digitally comes the aspect of data, and particularly data protection. It's a much beaten drum, but I think it's something that we need to consistently consider. We speak a lot about engaging with and soliciting the views and the information of forcibly displaced and other vulnerable people. And again, progress has been made on the part of humanitarians and others to effectively protect that data, whether under the realm of consumer protection or otherwise. But I would say further strides need to be taken to ensure that even in redressing the digital divide, we don't expose people to additional risk.
Thank you. Ines, anything on digital initiatives from the SBDR?
Yeah, well, in the digital part, as I mentioned, we have run this survey with these vulnerable segments, and in the case of the migrants and the refugees, we asked them if they use the digital channels and how easy it is for them to use them, and actually more than half they use the digital channels, so that's a good part. And the ones that use them, more than 70% actually agree that those channels are easy to use. And we asked them if they need SORA assistance to make transactions and so on, and 60% of them told us that they didn't need any assistance at all. 13% they say sometimes, and 25% more often. But it means that, I mean, so far the digital channels that we have in place are very friendly for them. But that's something that we want, you know, to follow up to understand, as you mentioned, if we are, if the digital are excluding them or not. And they agree, more than 40% agree that technology actually simplifies the processes. And something very interesting about the Venezuelan community is that they are very techy. Actually, yes, they have developed a lot of fintechs to send remittances using crypto. And as I mentioned, we are trying to, I mean, to put the money in the bright side using Visa and MasterCard. But actually, they have developed a lot of fintechs to send money back home using crypto assets.
Yeah, I see that. Thank you so much. Ines, we have a question from WFP.
Thank you. Yes, I work for the World Food Programme, and for those who are not quite sure what we have to do with it, it's the world's largest humanitarian organization transferring cash to people in need. So I felt compelled to reply to the constructive feedback that we've heard, especially from you, Edward. I know you have worked in such settings yourself. And just a note, of course, I need to also provide the reality of organizations like WFP who are dealing with very tough circumstances on front lines, often underfunded. So their focus is on delivering money, or in this case, money, to those in need in the best way they can with what they have. That's tough, and it's clear. We also recognize it that the capability of our staff on the front line, especially to engage with actors like central banks, is low. It's really not a conversation that they're used to having. So as the WFP, we've actually engaged with and recruited central bank experts to write guidance, help our colleagues in the field to engage with these authorities, which authorities, how, etc. So it's a start of a journey, but I wondered, in your research and in your experience, have you encountered any other good practice that we can take home and maybe think about as well?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for picking up. And I mean, from my own experience, I used to work with the Danish Refugee Council, so I think that's the experience I'll lean on most. And as well as sort of upskilling and providing guidance to colleagues operating across multiple countries on engagement with authorities more broadly, but specifically with central banks and others. Again, we leveraged our cash and voucher assistance program to, I guess, to not only continue to deliver and effectively deliver to people that relied upon our assistance, but to instill in our colleagues' minds the idea of sustainability and the idea that necessarily to fulfill our overarching strategic ambition as an organization, that direct delivery of cash by us was insufficient, and necessarily as a result of that we would need to begin to engage not only with private sector actors to deliver cash on our behalf, but to look at more sustainable solutions, be it engaging in advancing policy and regulation, or, as I'm sure you've been engaged in as well, the discussions around linking people to national systems of social protection. And what often happens in our sector is that we tend to put things in silos, and one good practice I saw was making sure that in efforts to engage with policy and regulation for financial inclusion, as well as efforts to engage with national systems of social protection, there was common learning that was shared between teams, either within context or between contexts at a regional rather than a global level, to again share learnings between them on how best to go about engaging with state authorities and particularly regulatory authorities. So in short, facilitating in a global role that I was in, exchange between countries on best practice, engaging with actors that we historically haven't engaged with, either for good reason or not.
Thank you for that question, and Edward for such a comprehensive reply. Anybody else have questions? Okay, so we're at time, and so we can start to conclude. Such a great session. I thought it was really nice that we could see different contexts from the low and middle income country parts of the world, but also to see the differences between a refugee context and an IDP context, looking how regulators look at things, but also how the private sector and the humanitarian partners also come into the whole picture. I'm not going to do the key takeaways, so based on surprise, but I'll wrap up quickly afterwards. But it's not going to be a hard one. Just based on our discussion and what we're trying to bring out for the audience here today, what's so close to our hearts, can we have one key takeaway from each of the speakers? Are you ready? For everyone to take home. It's such a serious issue, actually, that we're talking about. We could also be FDPs tomorrow, next week. So what should we take home with us today? Ines, please.
Okay, I know that everybody's hungry, so I was thinking about two, but I will just say one. So basically, the main recommendation can be to thinking the product suitability for the refugees, and the adaptation of a flexible KYC, and to understand if maybe there is a need. I mean, here it's basically try to listen, to understand, to gather some information about what are the needs of the refugees, what kind of product they need, and if they need to design something specifically for them, like it can be microloans, it can be something, as I mentioned, for remittances options, so they can have this empowerment to better have some financial health, and to be able to integrate themselves in the financial and social economic life of the country that are receiving them.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ines. Ed?
Sorry. Well, I think my takeaway, or what I'll continue to reflect on sometimes once you step into global positions and support organizations globally, you become somewhat removed from the realities of working on the ground. And to hear from Mohamed particularly, but also from Ines, about the challenges, but also the efforts that you've made to overcome those challenges in profoundly difficult circumstances is something that I think we can all learn from. And I'll reflect. I'll paraphrase the words of Ru, who spoke yesterday very eloquently, and it's probably one of my broader takeaways from this entire week. He mentioned how he's shifted from a point where everybody told him that his dreams were impossible to a point where he was driving his own destiny. And I think, whether it be in the discussion around listening to and understanding FDPs' voices, or in other realms in which we work, we always need to keep that at the forefront. And I think my key takeaway is that that everybody in this room, whether they're representing humanitarian organizations, microfinance institutions, or regulatory bodies and others, has that at the forefront of their mind. I think we need to regularly remind ourselves of that.
Thank you. Ed, Mohamed?
Yes, thank you. I just need to confirm what have been mentioned by Ines, and making sure that we really assess and having data from the ground on the real need of the ITPs, and accordingly having or complying with their needs, because sometimes we suggest products and services that not comply and not helping them in the current situation. And again, the collaboration between public-private institutions, humanitarian agencies is really important, and especially having a powerful regulator who can impose their regulation in this kind of situation. Thank you.
And Barnaby, finally.
I think you've said it all, but maybe just to sort of my sort of slight take on the similar issues is that it's really great to be seeing policy and regulatory issues discussed, and I think seeing one of the many barriers that there are, supply side, demand side barriers, FDP, financial inclusion, elevating it so that we think about that and then address the problems that we see on the policy and reg side. In a build coalitions, include the private sector, but also it needs to be quite that you can't necessarily solve these things to really stick with it.
Yes, thank you so much, Barnaby, for the patience bit. I don't come out that much, but that's so important for policy and regulation. We're data informed, but we take up these important problems and we need to also fuel, I think, our policies and regulations for even more problems coming our way. So thank you so much to these amazing, round of applause for them, please. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you again.